Now, on Monday, the eyes of the world will return to Minneapolis, the scene of George Floyd's killing. The city is braced for the trial of Derek Chauvin, a former police officer accused of murdering Mr. Floyd. The trial's being hailed as one of the most important in U.S. history and a defining moment for the nation and the civil rights movement. And joining me now to discuss this is Martin Luther King, the third civil rights activist and the son of Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll get to George Floyd and the court case in a moment, but I just wanted to talk to you about a new voting law in Georgia. Among other things, it imposes new ID requirements for mail-in voting, limits the availability of ballot drop boxes, a host of other things, a 98-page measure. It's been likened to the racist policies of the Deep South, said that the president, says it disproportionately targets Black Americans. What do you make of this new law?
Well, there's no question about that. The law was signed by the governor, I believe, on Thursday. And immediately, a number of community organizations came together to file a lawsuit. There's even a small provision or a provision in this law that says if you bring water to someone who is standing in line, who may have been standing in line for 4 or 5 hours, it is a crime. It is the most inhumane kind of thing that I've ever seen. And the only reason that it exists is because, on January 5th, the state of Georgia elected its first Black senator and its first Jewish senator, John Ossoff, Reverend Warfield Warnock, who's the pastor of Ebenezer Church, where my father was co-pastor. And the second issue, of course, in November of last year, we had an election. And for the first time, the state of Georgia voted for the Democratic ticket, President Biden and Vice President Harris. So clearly this provision is only to stifle and slow down Black people, students, brown people, and others from voting. It really makes no sense. In fact, the governor and the Secretary of State said we had no issues with the election in November, nor the election on January 5th. So why they would come and create these draconian laws is very suspect. And the fact that they do hearken back to Jim Crow, the Jim Crow era, where Blacks were not allowed to register because they'd ask questions like, well, how high is up? Or how many bubbles are in a bottle of soap? Who knows those answers?
So Jim Crow, just to give some sort of context, there were laws that enforced racial segregation, and they were actually enforced until the mid-'60s. Donald Trump, he lost Georgia by about 12,000 votes last year. He has celebrated these changes. You mentioned the governor, Brian Kemp. He said there's nothing Jim Crow about requiring a photo or state-issued ID to vote by absentee ballot. Every Georgia voter must already do so when voting in person. President Biden, the left and the national media are determined to destroy the sanctity and security of the ballot box. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, when you talk about reducing polling hours and places, for example, we used to have maybe a month and a half to vote early. They cut that back maybe to less than 30 days. There were certain boxes where you could go and drop off your ballots. Now you have to have some kind of notification or notarized scenario to make sure your ballot is legal. And again, some of these things, maybe if there was any proof of fraud of some kind. In fact, there was no fraud at all. The only thing that happened is more people voted than ever before, and they want to restrict people. It's interesting that we call ourselves a democracy, and we operate around the world talking about imposing or encouraging other countries to engage in democracy, but yet right at home, we are suppressing democracy. It's not about an ID. That's not the issue. The fact of the matter is, in Black communities and brown communities, there are lines sometimes that take hours to vote. And because of that, you should open up more lines or add more days for voting. There are provisions that you do to expand the right to vote, not to subtract and reduce. And what these people have done is they have created a scenario to subtract. By the way, just as they signed the law in the governor's office, and one of the state representatives was arrested for knocking on the door when public business was being done and other legislators were in there, but they did not want her in there. And so they arrested a sitting state representative who is trying to be a part of the process because she represents Georgians also. That's just unconscionable what this state has done. It's a sad, sad time for the state of Georgia, and I think for the United States, because there are 40 more states that are also looking at legislation.
In my reading about this, I came across Deborah Scott, the executive director of Georgia Stand Up. And she said, we're resilient, we have survived slavery, we have survived the first Jim Crow, and will definitely survive Jim Crow in a seersucker suit in 2021. One wonders when Black Americans don't have to be resilient enough to survive something as appalling as slavery, when they can just go about their business and exercise their democracy.
Well, you know, that's a very good question and observation. And the fact of the matter is, these draconian laws should not be enforced or should not be passed around this country. But they are being passed. And that just means that we do have to, and we will be vigilant, by the way. We're going to always be vigilant. In fact, my mom used to say that every generation has to earn its keep or its freedom. So freedom is just not a permanent thing. We would hope that there would be a day where that would happen. As you may remember, my father in his last speech talked about getting to the promised land. And he said, I've been to the mountaintop. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I know that we as a people will get to the promised land. And that meant all people, not just Black people, but all people who are suffering in our nation and really around the world. And so, again, we continue to be vigilant, and ultimately we will one day address these issues in a way, and new governing people will be put in place so that all of the people are represented truly with fairness and equity.
I'm glad you brought up your parents, Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King Jr. You are their oldest living child, just to give people who don't know you context. With everything that your father went through, with everything your mother went through, with everything you've been through, how do you feel as an American today?
Today, I certainly feel very saddened about where we are, but I'm also very hopeful because there are young people all over the world protesting for right. And so that is certainly inspiring. Yeah, my wife and I have a 12-year-old daughter. And she's an activist, a social justice activist. But there are many young people her age who are, you know, when I was her age, I didn't know anything about the issues that were going on around the world. But she knows about the issues. She knows about gun violence. She knows about these voting issues. And she and her friends are standing up with others across this nation. The Parkland students, they are protesting in a positive way. In fact, tragically, after George Floyd, and I know the trial is going on right now, tragically after his death, there were civil rights demonstrations in every state in our nation, the largest that we've ever seen, many of those led by white young people. But it was whites, it was Blacks, it was Latinos, Hispanics, it was Asians, it was wealthy people, it was poor people. So all coming together. And of course, protests obviously taking place in Europe, taking place in Australia, taking place in South America, on the African continent, just about every continent. And
Please
so
forgive me.
I'm hopeful.
Please forgive me for jumping in there, but I really want to know, what would you tell George Floyd? If you could speak to George Floyd, what would you tell him? Well, first of all, what I hope, and speaking to George Floyd, if I could speak to George Floyd, we wouldn't be at this moment. We are at a pivotal moment in the history of our nation. Oftentimes when policemen are charged, they are very rarely, if ever, convicted. My hope is that a conviction occurs, but the sad part about it is this man should not have had to lose his life it doesn't matter in this context but it was certainly a small crime. But the fact of the matter is he was asking for help, and this policeman stood on his neck, and we saw the breath taken away from him. And that should not have happened. That should never happen. Again,
policemen have to be held accountable. And if justice with a conviction is not seen, that's the thing that I worry about. And
Okay.
obviously the city of Minneapolis
We're
must be
going to have
worried
to
about
leave it there. I'm so sorry. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for talking to us, Martin Luther King III. Thank you so much.
Thank you.